Hello, welcome back to the Mob Archaeologists. I'm Angelo here with Rick, Eric, and Tony. And this episode, we're going to be discussing the leadership of the National American Mafia prior to the 1930s. Prior to that, we've gone into General Assembly versus the Grand Council, and we will be going through these letters now. This first letter is from 1908, and it's addressed from Giuseppe Morello to Rosario Dispenza at 147 Milton Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, from Giuseppe Morello. And it starts, "Dear friend, in answer to your letter that bears the date of the 10th, I hear what you say in it. Regarding the council, you have no right to be present in the meetings. The council is divided and separated from the assembly. But in case that some councilman wishes to be present or in some meeting of the assembly, he can come, but only to hear, and then has no right to the floor, neither right to an opinion or right to vote. Have I explained myself?"
Yeah, so, this is Giuseppe Morello, who at this time is the Capo dei Capi, and he's writing to either at the time or the guy who would become the Chicago boss. I'll let, Rick and Tony maybe elaborate on who he is. I'm going to leave some meat on the bone here because there's a lot to get from this. What's crucial about that paragraph is it confirms what Nicola Gentile said about the Grand Concilio and the National Assembly existing. These are two national bodies that Gentile talks about quite a bit. He doesn't really get into the specifics, and we can kind of infer some things. But you have Giuseppe Morello. One, he's indicating how highly organized and structured the early national bodies were at that time in Cosa Nostra. And he's explaining that a member of the Grand Concilio can attend the assembly meetings, but he can't intervene. He's saying he has no right to an opinion or a right to vote. And when you put that up against what Nicola Gentile said, who Gentile in an interview said he was part of the Grand Council, but it tells us, that the Grand Council had a different function than the Assembly. The Assembly would vote. Grand Council had maybe some sort of mediation. They were there maybe to advise. I think Gentile says the Grand Council advised the Capo, who presided over the Grand Council. So it doesn't really explain exactly what they do, but it tells us there's some distinction there. You want to go ahead, Rick?
See, there may be some explanation in contemporary events that could set us straight on what was going on in the letter. And, we may have a little dispute about it, but it's very possible that Rosario Dispenza was not the boss yet. So that's up for discussion. But if he was not the boss, if he was the underboss or a capo decina or some other position, then he may not have had access to the Grand Concilio. That may have been limited to actual representantes of the different families. The Grand Concilio and the National Assemblies, based upon what we read in the Barrel Mystery book by William Flynn, who is the head of the Secret Service, we learn that they use parliamentary procedures. And we also see this in Sicilian work. So this is something they carried over from Sicily. They utilized what they found in the culture, even if that meant adopting structure from the government or the military, and with a large group parliamentary procedure would work, and so they'd have to follow those standards where they'd make requests and petitions, and the structure was probably set in place very early, because what was here in the United States was based on what already existed in Sicily. And so for whatever reason, Rosario Dispenza in 1908 did not have access to the Grand Council. So, so the rest is up for discussion. But for just this section of the letter, that's what we know so far.
He's introducing him to the rules.
Tony?
Yeah, I think just for people who don't know who Rosario Dispenza was, he was from Chimena in Palermo province, and from sort of a cluster of towns to the east of Palermo city that had a major influence on the mafia, both early and even up through later decades in terms of the origins of some of the Chicago membership. And I believe he might have been the only boss, at least the only one I can think of confirmed offhand in the American Mafia, who was from Chimena. I don't know. I can't think of another person offhand. Maybe there was another one somewhere. An important town, in the history of the Mafia. Later on, Salvatore Catalano, who was a Bonanno Capodicina and involved heavily in heroin trafficking, including a major operation linked to Chicago in the 1970s. It was also from Chimena, and Chimena has to this day, a large community in Chicago, as well as in New York City, of course. So I don't know that he was the boss in 1908. The letter does seem to suggest that he might not have been, because one would think if he was the boss of Chicago, later on, probably bosses like, I would think, Tony DeAndrea and Michele Merlo in Chicago would have, I think, had seats on the Grand Consiglio. I don't know if Chicago was guaranteed a seat on the Grand Consiglio. I think it was one of the major families outside of New York in the country. I think that's pretty clear, so it's possible that they might have. But if he wasn't boss yet, it's possible that he wasn't able to participate in that. He didn't have that seat. But we don't really know what his position was. It's thought that another guy who's from Cacamo, Mariano Zagone, was the boss from around 1901-ish to about 1909 when he was murdered. And it's thought that Rosario Dispenza then became boss in 1909 when Zagone was killed, and so he was himself murdered in 1914. So I think it's pretty clear that when he was killed in 1914 that he was almost certainly the boss of the Chicago Mafia, right? But we don't know what his status was in 1908. As Rick said, he could have been an underboss. We don't know that Zagone, I think, 100% was boss. It's a good guess, right? But possible that he could have been underboss, Dispenza. Possible he could have been a consigliere. He could have been a Chicago's council, Capodicino, or he could have just been a soldier that was involved in this discussion. And we'll see. There's going to be the later paragraphs will give us some more context to why this letter is also being written.
Looking at the first paragraph, it can be interpreted many different ways. And the more, or when we read different tidbits of information, we can kind of go back to this and reevaluate it. But there's really nothing definitive at this point. One thing I have to wonder looking at this is, could this Dispenza have been a Chicago Consiglio member who wasn't able to sit in on a General Assembly? Because you would think that the Grand Council of the American Mafia outside of New York, one of the biggest contestants for who would have a seat on this would be Chicago.
Yeah, I want to just add something, just a little commentary. Like this is tangential, but about Chimena, because it's not a town a lot of people know of, but it really is a Western Sicilian Mafia stronghold. And Sal Catalano, the Bonanno, he was actually the acting boss of the Bonannos for a time, but he stepped down. And his first cousin, Onofrio, was the boss of Chimena itself. So he came from a clan. I mean, it's one of those places where a lot of interrelation. For all we know, there could be some deep interrelation between and some of these Chicago guys. We really don't know, but there is connectivity there. And, I get the impression from this, too, that kind of like Angelo was saying, it does sound like Dispenza may have recently been elected to the Grand Consiglio. We don't know exactly who the candidates were. We know Gentile was part of it for a time. It could have involved the consigliere of families. We know that New York had what they called their own consiglio after 1931, which was separate from the commission. Joe Valachi talked about it. And the consigliere of each New York family and the New Jersey family sat on that with a rotating boss, and they would arbitrate problems between soldiers and their own families. So it's possible the conciliary of families sat on the Grand Concilio, which would make some sense, but we really don't know what earned a seat on that. We don't know if it was limited to bosses like the later commission. We don't know if it was just guys who had respect and standing. So it's a little bit of a mystery. We can infer that it was very important and it had a very distinct set of rules.
Just to kind of add to that also, I mean, with Gentile, I'd have to go back and look at some of his text, but does he specify exactly what time period he was formally on the Grand Concilio? Because we know that in the 20s he was boss of Kansas City. So is it during the same time that he was boss? Because he had different positions in different families over the years, right? So that could be a clue as to whether or not one had to be the representante or the capo familia of a family, as opposed to another administration member or even a captain or something, right?
It looks like I have to go through it, and this Gentile deserves his own analysis. Like Angelo suggested. It does seem like he doesn't refer to participating in the Grand Concilio pre-1920. So it seems to coincide with him becoming Kansas City boss.
Yeah.
But then he's also a conciliary in Cleveland and Pittsburgh.
Right.
By the early 30s. So it does seem to coincide with his rise in official stature. So I do think there's something to high-ranking members being on the council.
Yeah, because we as we discussed before in a previous episode too, our best understanding, and this aligns with the way that we've seen some firsthand accounts from member sources, right, in FBI files talk about it, is that the family, is that the later commission was seen and was sometimes referred to as the Grand Concilio or the Concilio Supremo by some sources, right? So it's clearly seen, and it almost certainly historically was, an outgrowth of this earlier Grand Concilio. They just got rid of the capo conciliary or the boss of bosses position, right? So it is an extension of this earlier form. And we know from Salvatore Piscopo, the Los Angeles member who was an informant for the FBI in the early 1960s, he said that there could be a conciliary of a family could have a seat on the commission, could be the commission representative for that family. He didn't mention a specific person, and I don't think we know of one, right, who was the official commission representative for their family post 1931, who was actually conciliary and not boss, as far as I know.
Could have been like a sostituto. Maybe he didn't have the official seat, but he could represent his boss. Giuseppe Traina was, Michael DiLeonardo told us that he was the conciliary to D'Aquila, and he was allowed to represent D'Aquila as his sostituto, essentially the acting capo de capi. So it seems like and Bill Bonanno made some references like that indicate traditionally the conciliary stood in place of the boss. So that might explain Piscopo's thought that the conciliary could sit on the commission, maybe.
It's also possible that Paul Rica, he could have been considered conciliary while also holding ultimate power in Chicago. And so he certainly would have been allowed to sit on the commission, even while others, such as Sam Giancana, were the actual commission members.
Yeah. And also, I mean, the commission representative of the family, the formal commission representative who had the seat, was able to bring an aide with them also, right? So I'm not sure if that's what Piscopo. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's what Piscopo was referring to, as opposed to being the actual official commission representative that held or occupied that position. I mean, again, he didn't provide any examples, which would have been helpful,
Before we get to the next
paragraph, I think we got that from Joe Bonanno, and I didn't think he specified the rank of the person.
Yeah.
But before we move on to the next paragraph, I want to state the obvious that this letter's from 1908, and if we ever needed evidence of how highly structured, and not just highly structured, but the fact that the mafia was existing as a larger governing force, not just gangs who did business together, this just lays it all out very clearly if anybody had any doubts about that. And I want to add, too, there are no references that I know of to the Grand Concilio existing in Sicily, contemporary Sicily. But Dr. Melchior Allegra, when he was discussing the 1920s Palermo War, did make reference to a General Assembly there. So it does seem like these bodies, as we would expect, were carried over from Sicily. We just don't have explicit references outside of a 1920s Palermo Assembly being held for the war.
Well, another thing is back in Italy, in the 19th century, there were many different secret societies. Most of them were not um, criminally related, but these secret societies, they had grand consiglios and general assemblies, especially the much larger ones. So this was already a system that was being replicated by the mafia. So they did not come up
Yep.
with this system by themselves. It was something that was replicated.
Yep.
Well, I know we want to move on to the next paragraph, just because it's the topic right now is the sort of what we think could have been the role and the difference between the Grand Concilio or Concilio Supremo versus the Assemblea, and we know also that later on with the commission was seen as being the equivalent at the level of the national American mafia of the Concilia, the actual councils that many families, as we've discussed, had, right? And even, say, for example, when Frank Bompensero reported that Chicago in the 1960s had a concilio, right, which is the term that they used, he said that this was like a commissione, in quotes, right, for the family, right? So clearly people saw that these were similar structures or analogous structures at different levels of representation within the mafia political system, the national level and then the family level, right? And we also know from Milwaukee member informant Augie Maniaci in the 1960s, some Milwaukee had a council, which they called Saggio, or the chair, right? And it also had a body or a procedural event, right, called the Torna, which was a meeting of the entire membership of the family. And I believe that's where they would, historically, they would basically vote to induct new members and so forth. So periodically they would have these. To me, that sounds like an assembly in miniature, right? Where the membership of the family who don't have seats on this council or Saja, right, are able to come together, cast votes and so forth, maybe be polled on their opinions and sort of have some form, or at least some, as Gentile said, the mafia has the farce of democracy or something like that, right? The trappings of democracy, but not the substance of it, right? But I mean, and by the 1960s, Maniaci was also clear that the Torna had long since fallen into disuse, and the council itself had basically fallen into disuse under Balestrieri, right? But this was something they did before. That's very interesting because we can assume, even if we don't have accounts, that other families would have had similar things. So I've wondered, if the assembly was a general meeting of members, they could be soldiers, they could be captains, right, from around the country, who would vote for certain things. Maybe they voted for who would have seats on the Grand Concilio.
They were voting life or death. We know from Gentile that, but that seems to be based on what Morello said here. To quote our buddy Morello, it seems like the assembly were the ones who actually voted, and just like we don't know who sat on the assembly, we don't know who sat on the council. We don't know exactly who. Was it a representative from every family in the United States? Was it just regional representatives who were directly concerned with that issue? We have the Hotel Statler meeting in 1928, Cleveland, where a lot of prominent mafiosi were arrested. We don't know if that was an assembly. I mean, we can assume. We don't know if the Grand Council had their own meetings with that many people, or if we don't really know. We don't really know those things. And like you were getting at, there is an as above, so below effect in the mafia where you were saying this, where individual families had their own concilio, which was separate from the administration. It was typically 5 guys who voted on matters of administration, completely separate, not completely. It included the administration, but it wasn't the administration. They also had these Turna meetings. Rocco Scafidi in Philadelphia talked about how in previous days, the Philadelphia family had these meetings of the entire family,
right,
where administrative changes could happen as well as inductions. Joe Bonanno talked about the entire family meeting to hold the election for boss. So I think this is something that they traditionally had within families as well as within the national body.
Yeah,
they were meant to mirror each other.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on some things that you guys said. My opinion is that the 1928 Statler meeting would have been too large. That the Grand Concilio was probably a much smaller body, and it could have been something that advised the boss of bosses Well, I mean, we don't know its exact function. It could have been sort of an operational investigative committee, which went into specific matters, and they gave referrals to the National Assembly or to the boss of bosses who chaired the National Assemblies. And another thing I wanted to bring up that's relevant to a point that Eric made is that this illustrates the connectedness between the different families, and with other material that we have from Italy, that it also works internationally to expose it. And this is a contrast to a theory that was in vogue in the early 1970s and late 60s called the alien conspiracy theory, and that was held by academics like Joseph Albini and Dwight Smith, and who believed that the mafia was just a local phenomenon, that there really wasn't this sort of networking and connectedness between the families, even though Joe Valachi had already testified. But they were very skeptical of his testimony. But I think if they look back far enough, such as to the Barrel Mystery book, which was published in 1919, I believe, they would have found that plenty of evidence for the early existence of these networks, that it was a conspiracy in the true sense of the word, and it did extend out internationally. I mean, they brought this with them. We can see that continuity, and not just in the ranks, but in the rituals. And while we don't necessarily have evidence for every structure that existed, like the Grand Concilio, a lot of it can be inferred from the evidence that we do have. And so this is a good refutation of the dismissal of what they called the alien conspiracy theory.
Well, another thing to expand on is this was even emphasized in the Last Testament of Luciano, where a lot of people got this idea from, is that all these guys were coming to America and starting fights with each other. Like they had no idea who each other was, and it's like taking ants from a different colony and putting them all into one space and watching them go at each other. No, it wasn't like that at all. This was a process. This was a bureaucracy. If a family was already established in a certain city, anybody else coming there would have to join that family who is already a member. They're transferring. Only under certain occasions would people get permission to form their secondary or tertiary groups. But the point is, this was an agreed upon process and a structure that was going on. And it was more of a bureaucracy, as we're seeing with this letter, than it is a full-blown criminal organization for the sole purpose of committing crime.
I want to add one last thing on this paragraph. I know we got to move on to others, but what Rick said about the Grand Concilio advising the capo, I do think there's something to that. Joe Bonanno insisted in his book, he didn't talk about the Grand Concilio, but he insisted that traditionally what we call the boss of bosses was called the capo conciliare, head counselor. That implies that the capo was actually the head of the Grand Concilio. And Gentile says that one of the purposes of the Grand Concilio, one of the only times he really sheds light, was to advise the capo. So I do think there's something to the idea that, for all we know, the capo was elected from the Grand Council and he presided over them. Just like maybe the commission had sort of a chairman who was much less powerful, we know. But still, there's something to that where the Grand Council was, their relationship to the national body seems to have been around the capo. rather than separate. He seems to have been a part of them who presided over them. The capo consigliere, as Bonanno said.
This is for your guidance. Now, regarding Caligero Costantino, to tell you the truth, I have as yet been unable to persuade myself as to what it is about. The letters to me have not been satisfying or convincing. There should have been better explanations. In this matter, I cannot, with exact judgment and clear conscience, I cannot understand how it is that Caligero Costantino remains arrested in Vaucluse, Louisiana, while under the protection of so many good friends engaged incessantly to help him obtain his liberty. And you others of Chicago have all this contract on your side.
Don't have anything to comment on. Just want to point out that the first time I ever read this letter, I thought they were talking about Carlo Costantino, who was, as you guys identified in your Informer article, an early member of the Bonanno family from Pardinico. And this is a different guy. This is not Carlo Costantino, who was a well-known New York member, probably a high-ranking member of what we call the Bonannos today. So I just want to clarify, this is in reference to a guy in Chicago, Calogero Constantino, not Carlo Costantino.
Yeah, well, we know about Caligero Constantino is that he was born in Corleone in 1878, and his grandparents were actually from Partinico, and so it's possible that they were distantly related. We don't know. He immigrated into America, I believe, around 1902, and came to New York, and then he married in Kansas City, and he was there for a couple of years before moving on to Chicago. And so we're not exactly sure where he was made. He may have been made in Kansas City. If we don't know for an absolute fact if Kansas City was even a family at that time, but it's very possible, considering that St. Louis seems to go way back. So, and it appears that neither Chicago nor New York had responsibility for him. Now, Bogalusa, that's Bogalusa in Washington Parish, Louisiana. And there was a John Galota who he owned a grocery over there. So he was probably the New Orleans member operating over there. It's about 70 miles north of New Orleans. And he was probably with him while he was hiding out during this period. And later on, he was under indictment for kidnapping of a child, along with the Nicolosis, who Tony had discussed earlier. And he went on the lam to San Diego. And so he was a very early mafia member that was in San Diego, and he became a citizen down there. And a city councilman was a witness to his naturalization in 1920. So we don't know if he was like an early capo or something down there. We really don't know anything about him down there. But it's significant that there were a number of corleonesi members in Los Angeles, going way back, possibly as far back as the 1880s. There was a Salvatore Strava who was active in the same period that Constantino was in San Diego. And so he may have been an early Los Angeles boss. And he came from Corleone, and he appears to have mentored Jack Dragna later on, who we know was the boss from 1931 to 1956. So we do have a bit of information on him, but we'd love to have more details.
Amazing. I didn't know all that. That's It's great to know.
Well, I don't want to, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds here because we can also sort of, as Eric, his felicitous turn of phrase was, leave some meat on the bone. But there's a lot there, and it's important, of course. I mean, just to kind of underscore, people that know a lot about this early mafia stuff, of course, will know that Giuseppe Peter Morello was Corleonese, and his family was considered a Corleonese family, even though all the membership was not from Corleone, which is something I think we'll get into with this towards the end of this letter. But the sort of dominant character of the family is it was led by men from the Mafia of Corleone in New York. But as Rick said, I mean, there were Corleonese mafiosi that were important early on in Louisiana, in Los Angeles, and also, people don't know this, but in Chicago there was a cluster, seems to have been a really important cluster of Corleonese mafiosi in the Little Sicily neighborhood on the near north side for the first couple decades of the 20th century, or probably before that. There was Corleonese coming to Chicago in the 1880s. So they probably were an important part of the early, late 19th century mafia formation in Chicago, I think, and would have been, obviously completely plugged in with this national Corleonese network. So Rick brought up Strava. Let's see if I can do this quickly. So Morello, right, again, at this point, he's the boss of what later splits and we later on know as the Lucchese and Genovese families, right? There was, I believe, I assume he was a member. I'm not sure if there's exact information on his membership status. He died sometime, I believe, around 1918, if I'm not mistaken. But there was Andrea Oliveri, who was from Corleone and was a mafioso in East Harlem. The sort of area associated with the Terranovas and a lot of heavy early mafia activity, right? And his wife was a Strava. His daughter, Angelina, wound up marrying later Lucchese family boss Gaetano Reina, right? And her cousin was Salvatore Sam Oliveri, who was in the 1920s, at least, a Chicago member. I believe he subsequently transferred around 1930 to the Lucchese's briefly, and then transferred after that, it seems, to Rockford, where he stayed until he died in the 1960s. But during the 1910s and 20s, he was almost certainly a Chicago member, as was his relative Giovanni Oliveri, who may have been a half-brother of his or may have been a cousin. It's kind of unclear. But they were also, what's interesting is they were also brothers-in-law, aside from being relatives, all from Corleone, because they both married sisters from the Marino family. And those were nieces of the same Antonino Marino, whose son was kidnapped in 1911 by the same Calogero Constantino, who was the subject of this letter, and who clearly before 1911 was causing some sort of issue between the leadership or the membership of Chicago and Morello. There was some sort of issue happening. Something was going on with this guy, Calogero Constantino. He seems like he was probably causing a lot of trouble, as some of these young guys were. They were in the mafia system, but some of these young guys were probably pretty thugged out, if you want to use that phrase. And they were also, rising, probably trying to push back and, see some opportunities for themselves and so forth, right? So, yeah, in 1911, Constantino, with his paisani in Chicago, the Nicolosi brothers, who were suspects in the murder of Mariano Sagoni in 1909 that I mentioned earlier, who was thought to probably have been the boss before Rosario Dispenza, who was, again, one of the, interlocutors in this letter. All these things kind of like circle back around to each other, right? So in 1911, Constantino, as Rick said, basically had a lammet from Chicago because he was involved with the Nicolosis and their wives in the kidnapping of one of their paisani, whose father was probably also connected to the mafia, Antonino Marino, and he was the uncle of the Oliveri brothers' wives. So all these things kind of wrap around each other, right? But there was actually this really kind of tight-knit, seems to have been really important early on, Corleonese component in Chicago also, as well as these other cities. And it was connected because people would move around and so forth. We don't know what issue was surrounding Calogero Constantino in 1908. Seems like something had happened where maybe he had been in Chicago and had to lam it to Louisiana. And it seems that, at least from my reading, it seems that Morello is he's becoming annoyed with Chicago because they're not doing something for Constantino that they should be. He said, you in Chicago with all of your contracts and I'm not sure this has been translated. Angelo, you didn't translate this, even though you're Sicilian, right? This was translated already from a book, and so I don't know if any of us have seen. I haven't seen the original Italian, or I don't know if it was an Italian or Sicilian, presumably Italian, since they're writing what the original text would have been, right? But a word like contract and what they might have meant by that could have been really important. What do they mean by that?
It's in one of the next paragraphs.
Oh, there you go. So there you go. That's right. Yeah. We'll get into it, but just to give a context on this stuff. And again, once you start pulling a thread, this stuff, not only does it get into deep Chicago stuff, it starts going all over the country, and in some cases back to Sicily, right? And once you start following up on one of these guys, right, you'll start seeing connections that go all around the country. So we already have connections to Louisiana, to Chicago, to LA, and to the early Corleonese family, and then later on the boss of the Lucchese family. Just coming out of this one little person from this letter, right?
Real quick, Angelo, I'm just going to butt in real quick. Two things I just want to point out real quick. The guy you mentioned, Sam Oliveri, he was arrested at the 1928 Hotel Statler meeting.
Yes.
So there's questions about what his status was. Was he a high-ranking member? Was he involved with the Grand Concilio? Was he just a soldier who was representing a certain interest at that meeting?
Yeah.
And then he came to the U.S. I don't know nearly as much about him as you, but he came to the U.S. with a Nicolosi, probably relative of the Chicago ones, and he was a second cousin of a future New Orleans boss from Corleone, Leo Luca Trombetore.
Trombetore, yeah, that's I
that out. I mean, like you were saying, this. If you're trying to take a string around this, it's like it wraps around here, goes here, comes back. They kidnap this guy's kid who connects to this guy, and it's a wild journey of interconnectivity.
Yeah, so I mean, Rick brings up Strava, and I'm like, well, Strava, that I don't know what the exact relation would have been, but that was Andrea Oliveri's wife, right? And his son-in-law was Gaetano Reina, the boss of the Lucchese family. So this stuff all, from East Harlem to the Bronx to Los Angeles and to everything in between.
Yeah, there were actually two Salvatore Stravas in Los Angeles at the time, so it can be a little confusing.
A lot of Corleones.
They were all related. They were all related.
I have said it more than once that I and my townsmen have always known the Constantino family as a good family, and none other but very good. And the boss of my town, I am sure, cannot give you better details, though I doubt if they knew this family just because they were not to our bearing, but nonetheless leaning towards good people. Have you seen the ox? Neither white nor black. This is their bearing. But not for this, I repeat, always of good people. There have been born at times people that had given a good account of their being honored and respected as always.
Okay, well, this gives me a chance to flex my poetry analysis skills.
It's like reading Shakespeare.
But here's my interpretation. You guys can disagree, of course, but my interpretation. Obviously, townsman refers to compaesani. He's referring to people from Corleone. He's saying they're a good. The Constantino family, who comes from Corleone, are a good family, but none other than very good. So they're good, but not anything beyond that. And he says the boss of Corleone. So it shows that the boss of Corleone itself is part of all these politics. He can be made reference to, and. But this is the part that gets interesting, is he says they were not to the Constantino family is not to our bearing, but leaning toward good people. Have you seen the ox, neither white nor black? This is their bearing. What I interpret this to mean is they're not a mafia family or not a core mafia clan from Corleone like the ones we were just talking about. But they're not cooperators with law enforcement. They probably don't have police officers in their family. They're simply people who are amenable to the practices of Cosa Nostra, but not necessarily a core part of it. That seems to be what he's saying. And this phrase of good people and good families, that's something that's come up multiple times. When Dr. Melchior Allegro was made in Pagliarelli, when they proposed him for membership, they said, you come from a good family. And that can sometimes mean you come from a family with members, men who we know in our network. But like this is saying, the ox, neither white nor black, it can also just mean they're neutral. He's amenable, but he might not have come come up in it within his clan, within his family.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate that we don't have the original Italian. That so good people is can be interpreted different ways, and if we had the original language, that could probably help us interpret this a little bit better. So I don't really have much to add beyond what you said on this paragraph. So I think you covered a lot of it, and so we'll see if Tony has more to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's of course the first time I read this letter, and the times I've read it since, the sort of evocative language does strike one, right? You see the pictures of Peter Morello, and you hear the stories about these people, and you think these guys were just sort of uncouth, savage thugs, right? It doesn't mean they didn't have that element to them also, right? But there was a poetry to the way that they talked, as well as all this sort of formal, bureaucratic kind of procedural emphasis, right, and how things are done and how the rules are practiced and how these bodies interrelate. But the ox neither black nor white. And of course, it's just the same way that Eric read it. I mean, I read it as when he says these people are good people, they come from a good family, but they're neither black nor white. They're not anti-mafia, but they're not mafia, right? So they're not a family that has a membership lineage in the Corleonese mafia, is how I read it. But they're also not people that are known to have been associated with infamita, right? They're not rats, right? They're not people that have gone to the authorities or cooperate with the authorities, or else I don't think he would have said they're good people. So that concept of infamita, along with onuri, those are important things, right? And the way that the mafia operationalizes those might be different than how people might think also, right? So, infamy versus honor, to them has to do with their own code of honor and their understanding of how they relate to things like the state and the police and so forth, right? But if this had been a family that was associated with infamita, they would not be a good family. That's what I assume. And Rick noted earlier, too, that the Constantino family goes back to Partenico. And so it could be that maybe these people do have connections to the mafia, because we know that surname is definitely connected to the mafia with the Petrosino murder and so forth, and in Partenico, right? So if he's relatives of those people, maybe his family is from a mafia lineage, but they're just not associated with the Corleone family. So the Corleone family can't themselves vouch for him, aside from saying his family is not known for being a bad family, right? And I think we'll get into this in the next paragraph. My first reading of this letter, I actually assumed that Dispenza was inquiring on behalf of the Chicago family because they wanted to induct Constantino. And Rick said before, maybe he was inducted in Kansas City. We don't really know, right? Maybe the reason why they're bringing this up is because, maybe Chicago wants to make him. Maybe he's in trouble. They want to protect him. There's some context later in the letter, I think, for the fact that he may be under threat, right? And maybe Chicago wants to protect him. If Rosario Dispenza and if Zagoni's the boss, neither of these guys are Corleones, right? So they themselves can't inquire amongst their own paisani to see, is his family a family that's committed infamita? Are they bad people from our perspective, right? Or is he suitable for membership? Which is possible. We don't know at this time actually what Constantino's status is, right? I don't think anything in the letter confirms that he was yet a member necessarily, right? Just that he was known to them.
Yeah, he could have been a member, but we don't really have enough information to make a final determination.
Yeah, he might have been an associate at this point of the Chicago family or some other family who was in trouble somehow in Louisiana. Morello seems to be saying Chicago's not doing enough for him. You have, with all your contract, whatever that means. Does that mean, contract in the way we think of it, like they're, all your killers or something? Does that mean all of your political influence, right? There's something he's saying, you're not doing something with the resources you guys have in regards to whatever the issue is with Constantino, right?
Yeah, I think there may be some information in the next paragraph that clues us in, and it could be interpreted that he is a member. So
I'm not saying
that's up for discussion.
Yeah, I've read it. I've read it multiple ways, which I think all of us probably have, because I think all of us have read it multiple times. The way I read it the first time is not the way I read it now, right? But I'll cede the floor to Angelo. Go ahead, man.
What I see with this part is just the vetting system. the way people are constantly checking with other people, making confirmation, even though this isn't a third-party introduction in modern times as we understand it, it's still the same principle being applied. People are doing their research and they're vetting certain names of either whether they're affiliates or whether they're members. They need confirmation. We of Corleone have never had any dealings with them, therefore could not try and appreciate their merits. Other that have had dealings, that is to say, have known their good merits and have brought them to make part of our family. Nothing extraordinary, because certainly that would not have brought them in this land if they had not known their good merits. They have done well. We of Corleone will appreciate such things. Now, before we go on, I just want to say again, this letter was translated from Italian to English. We don't have the original. We don't know if they're saying Noi de Corleone or using Corleonese, like in terms of affiliation. So we of Corleone could be we from the city of Corleone, or it could be we who are affiliated with Corleone, like the Bananos and Castellamare, going forward with that. But
Okay, this is an interesting one in contrast with the last one, because the last one, it seems like he's kind of distancing himself. He's saying, like, we know of them to be a decent family who's potentially amenable to Cosa Nostra, but not necessarily members or not necessarily a core part of our system. This one, though, he indicates that I read this as some members of this family have been brought into the mafia in the United States after proving themselves. That's very interpretive, but he specifically says, and again, this could have been translated, it was translated from Italian or dialect. There may have been phrasing that is important to this we don't have, but he says, and have brought them to make part of our family. And it specifically says, certainly would not have brought them in this land if they had not known their good merits. They have done well. We of Corleone will appreciate said doings. I read that as, they weren't a core part of this clan system that informed the membership in Corleone proper, but members of the Constantino family who could be brothers, cousins, could be extended. We know these clans are big. It sounds like they've done something to earn respect within the mafia network in the United States, and some of them may be members. This is my interpretation.
My interpretation of we of Corleone is that it's referring to the Borgata in which Giuseppe Morello was the representante. That even though not necessarily every member of his Borgata was Corleonese, it was dominated by Corleonese. And so that could have been a descriptor that was used. That they're mostly Corleone's clan, and we'll get down later and we'll see that a significant number were actually from there, so it fits. And so when he talks about it, he seems to be talking about it in this country. And as I mentioned earlier, originally Constantino came to New York, and he was there a couple of years before he went to Kansas City. And so they may not have any personal dealings with him during that time. So he maybe wasn't a member yet. And, they may have been aware of him, but it may have been limited to that. That's what I get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to this. I mean, aside from, I think Eric's right to point to a sort of shift in this next paragraph. And it seems, without recourse to the original untranslated text, the best reading does seem to be Morello is saying, look, these people were not part of the mafia network within Corleone, even though their family is not known to be a bad family, but someone related to him has made a good name for this family within the U.S., which would seem to support that somebody was inducted, right? If, maybe they were not inducted, but they were an associate that had earned some sort of, respect. And as we'll see, I think in the next paragraph, they do confirm, of course, that they knew Calogero Constantino while he was in New York. So not just his family, but he himself is a known quantity to them. They haven't seen him in a while.
In your letter, you tell me that regarding Calogero Constantino, there is nothing to say, but there should be exact information because there are 8 good workers sick to put the work on him, and of the 8 persons, there are those in danger of their lives. But you must excuse me if I and others have not understood such language.
I hear a murder contract being discussed. This to me recontextualizes the letter and tells me that Dispenza was seeking Constantino's murder, contacted his Corleonese compaesani before doing that, because we know that was an important part of this, because that could potentially, there's a reason why the Castellamarese War is called the Castellamarese War, because the murder of a prominent Castellamarese resulted in his compaesani rallying and seeing it as an affront to themselves. So compaesani politics, they'll come up in the subsequent paragraphs. They were it was very precarious how you go about killing somebody from a certain hometown. What I want to point out, I'm kind of glad I got to go first here, because 8 good workers, that indicate, because we know now that it's a common euphemism in modern decades to refer to murder as a piece of work. And sometimes they'll refer to a guy as a good worker, and that refers to he's a good killer. This tells us that euphemism of worker has much earlier origins, which is pretty amazing. Another one that has early origins, just as a tangent, is Dr. Melchior Allegra referred to belonging to the button, bottone, or however you say it. So some of these things that we think of as modern American slang that they came up with to refer to certain, situations or just a button man, we think of that as very American, very, streets of New York. He has his button. The Godfather says, it's a guy who pushes the button. Allegra refers to belonging to the button. Here we have Giuseppe Morello saying eight good workers, and they're going to put the work on him. I think we know what he's referring to, and it shows how old that terminology is,
I think that's a very good point, that it tells us how old some of these terms are, that, and they may have, since this was originally in Italian, this may have carried over, this slang may have carried over from Sicily. It could have originated in the United States. We don't know, but very likely, I think it could have a Sicilian origin. That was a slang in the Sicilian underworld. And then when he talks about the 8 workers in danger, since we don't know the situation, are they in danger for having violated some protocol? Did they mess up an assignment? And that Calogero Constantino was the cause of that, or somehow involved, or did they get captured by the law? So he's really hiding out in, like I said, in Louisiana, and so this was Jim Crow days. So, and they didn't always treat Italians with respect. I'll put it that way. They could be pretty brutal back then, and so so since we don't know the situation, we don't know who the threat to their lives is coming from. So either scenario is possible, the way I see it. Tony?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's at one hand, it's clear that the 8 good workers, right? And I think this also kind of harkens to the good killers, team under the Bonanno family that was involved in killings in places like Detroit, right? They were referred to as the good killers, right? It kind of evokes that. Again, this sort of language is not something that came out of, the American English-speaking underworld in many cases. So yeah, there's a lot of examples of stuff that as we delve into these things, we realize they're direct cognates or direct translations from the Sicilian or Italian original term, which seems to have been around, a long time, going back to the late 19th century. Another one, just to give an example as a tangent, is when a guy gets made, the ceremony, guys to this day will refer to it as he got his finger pricked. Well, in Sicilian, this is punciuta. Literally means to prick or to pierce. Another term for the making ceremony in Sicilian is combinazione, which means to make, to put together. So a made guy, right? He's made. It's like a literal translation. So these things are not just English slang that emerged out of nowhere or just came from the underworld argot. This stuff, in many cases, these things are still used to today in the American mob. I mean, they go back and they're direct translations from the Sicilian or Italian equivalent. But to go to Eric's point and Rick's point, so part of it is pretty clear. It's clear that there is a team of killers who want to kill Constantino. It's not. It could be that these are Dispenza's men. I'm not sure that that's evident, though. I'm not saying that's wrong, right? I actually, reading it, I'm not sure who's trying to kill him. Are they Chicago guys? Are they Morello, Corleonesi, Borgata, New York guys? Are they from an entirely different family affiliated with Sicily or with another U.S. family? Right? It's not clear to me exactly who wants to kill him and also who wants to protect him. It could be that Dispenza wants to kill him. It could be Dispenza is trying to protect them. Morello is irritated about something regarding Constantino with Chicago. Chicago's not doing something even though they should have the ability to do it. Is it they're not killing him when they should be able to kill him? Or is it they're not protecting him when they should be able to protect him? Something, they're not holding up something that he sees as something they should be capable of taking care of. But it's not clear to me exactly who wants to kill him and who wants to protect them. And as Rick said, it's not clear why this team of killers, I would read that the Italian or Sicilian original probably would have been lavoratori, right? Workers, right? That's probably what the original was, right? But whoever these men were, who are they in danger from? Could be the police, could be another family. We don't know why they want to kill him. We don't know if his hit has been sanctioned. We don't know if there's a conflict or a war. So it might not even be like a sanctioned protocol. It could be that there's a split somewhere or a faction within a family, between families, right?
You notice that 8. He specifically says 8. Like, why not 10? Why not 5? Yeah. It indicates that there are 8 individuals who have already been contacted. And maybe not. Maybe he just threw 8 up there, but he didn't have to say 8. So it seems like, and that's about the size of a hit team. When you figure like 2 guys to do the shooting, a getaway guy, blockers, whatever. I mean, it's not uncommon for a hit team to be about 8 guys. Not that it's a set in stone, like a hit team has to have 8, but you don't have to.
It's somewhere between about 5 and 8 or something around there, including lookouts, wheelmen, right? Guys to lure him, somebody that he trusts or something to get him out of hiding, right? Ask for a meeting, the ways that they tend to set guys up, especially if the guy knows there's a contract on his head, right? But it's unclear. I mean, is there a contract in the sense that a hit was approved on him? Or is there a rogue group of guys out there trying to do it, right? I don't know. I mean, the fact that he calls them good workers would seem to align with them being officially approved to put a hit on him. But we don't know. I mean, was it the Morello family? Was it Chicago? Was it an entirely different family?
Yeah, I'd like to squeeze in just a little bit if I can. I think you made a good point. Where, like the good killers, they traveled around the country committing hits. And so was this an early hit team? I mean, that's a good question.
Very good point.
If these people were in Louisiana, were they working for the New Orleans family? Or were they contracted to do a job for the New Orleans family? I mean, there's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, we don't know what Constantino had done to arouse somebody's ire, right? We don't know who wanted him dead and what for. Clearly something happened. Somebody really wanted him dead. Those guys had now got themselves in some sort of trouble over this issue, right? That's what it seems like. They're in danger now for some reason. But again, we don't really know what he did and why they want to kill him and who wants to kill him. And if either one of these, either Morello or Dispenza, is trying to protect him or kill him. I think that, depending on the lens you want to use, you could read it. It could support multiple different narratives, right?
If you know that Constantino is of good health, also he is severely of good health, you will take with the other townsmen of yours the responsibility here and also of the town, and we will do everything. Neither I nor others here can understand how you ever in your wise thinking write us in this manner. If I have written to you more than once that this Constantino family have never been to our hearing, known to us only by sight in America as in the town, and then this is not enough. Really should not ignore the fact Calidro Costantino has been missing from New York at least 6 years.
So this one, it seems pretty clear that Dispenza is being chastised by Morello. It seems, he uses the word responsibility. He seems to be saying that Constantino is Dispenza's responsibility. That the beginning, I want to mention. I mean, I don't know what severely of good health means, but he says you will take with other townsmen of yours the responsibility here and also of the town. You could read that as he's saying men from Chimina, which is Dispenza's hometown. You would think that's what he means, but if you actually look at it, taking responsibility here and also of the town, he could have been saying Borgata, which we know is a term for family, but it corresponds to a township or a borough. So I think he's actually saying you need to take responsibility for your Borgata rather than men from Chimina specifically being responsible for handling this. Hard to gauge, but that's my interpretation. He's definitely chastising him, though. He's saying, like, how did you think it was wise to write us in this manner? Basically, it seems to me like Dispenza was seeking Morello's help with this murder, and Morello's saying basically, like, this is your family affair. This guy's he brings up again that they don't really know the Constantino clan. They're known to us only by sight in America, as in the town. So this is Morello saying this isn't my responsibility. And then at the end, to confirm that, he says he hasn't even been in New York for 6 years. So he's saying he's not responsible for him as part of his Campesani network. Neither is he responsible for him in New York. That's kind of how I read this.
Yeah, I read a lot of this the same way, that I do think that the letter is referring to the Chicago Borgata, Chicago family, that they should be doing whatever it is they're supposed to do. Now, I don't know if that means to kill him, or since he's hiding out, are they supposed to help him? Are they supposed to give him supplies, or, give him another hiding place, move him around the country? So, that's open for interpretation. And, severely of good health. In a lot of languages, if you repeat the word twice, it makes it sound like very or extremely. So, such as extremely good health. So that's the meaning I get out of it. I could be wrong since we don't have the original language, but healthy or very healthy, I mean, doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But we also have to remember that in general, the writing, this early 1900s, the writing was very stilted. It's very formal compared to how we write and speak today. That he was missing from New York at least 6 years. Now, from what we've read so far, it seems like they knew about him, but I didn't really get the impression that he was personally known. But here he's gone missing. So was he a formal associate of somebody? Maybe not the Corleone's clan, maybe not Morello's Borgata, but another Borgata. Could he have been with what later became the Bonanos? Based on his Partinico heritage.
Good point.
That we don't know. And but for him to say that he's missing, that to me, that means something, that he's missing at least 6 years. So if he's missing, that means he should be in New York. Why isn't he there? And said he disappeared from New York and he went to Kansas City and then Chicago. And now he's in Louisiana. So why is that? So, Tony?
Yeah. That's, I mean, I think just again, the point about what he means by the town and the townsman, right? I mean, this is something where, I mean, just there can be multiple layers, right? So there's formal speech that's used, the sort of formal register that's used in letter writing, right? Compounded with the sort of formalistic, procedural kind of way these mafia, leaders talk to each other. There's idiomatic stuff also, right? There's idiomatic stuff that could be general to Sicilian culture, right? So like it goes to the severely, right? I mean, who knows what we'd have to see what the original is actually saying. Who knows if that just means like he's saying he's in really good health. But why is he bringing that up, and why is that important to this conversation for him to talk about his health? Because he should be dead, and he's not dead. I mean, it's also like, but that could be an idiomatic. That could be like a cultural idiom that we're not getting. It also could be an idiom within the mafia that's not a general Sicilian idiom. So these could be codes for things also, right? That could be a reference to something that in the original he would assume that Dispenza would understand, either because of general cultural idioms or because of specific things within the mafia and how they talk and use language. There's a lot that we could be missing even if we had the original. But for townsmen and towns in a town, right? Yeah, is he saying Borgata? Is he saying Comuni? Is he saying Paesi? Right? What is he saying? Right? Because if he's saying Borgata, then that would probably be very clear, right? Because formally, Borgata refers to the suburbs in the Conca de Oro citrus growing area right in the periphery of Palermo, right? Whereas towns and villages and other places were called, Comuni, Frazioni, right? That kind of stuff, right? So if he's using Borgata, then he's not referring to Cimino or Corleone, right? He's referring to a mafia family, almost certainly, right? And if he's referring to the Borgata of Dispenza, like Eric said, then he's almost certainly referring to the Chicago family. And he's using townsmen to mean the members of the family, whether or not they all come from Cimino. Or he could be, I mean, there was also a cluster of people from Cimino. Chicago had people from Cimino, from the neighboring town of Ventimiglia di Sicilia, Cacamo. All of them probably formed a network in Chicago. So it could be read multiple ways, even if we had the original, right? But it'll be good to know. What did he say? Borgata? Did he say Comuni? Right? Paesi? Yeah, and there's a lot there. And why is it important that he's in good health? Severely good health, whatever that actually means, right? A lot of nuance that can be carried. We know that in general, a lot of these mob guys, even in modern times, they can say a lot in very few words, right?
You should have said.
Yeah, there you go. We know it even from here. They can call somebody
communicated in what's not said than what's actually said.
Well, you think about some of these, transcripts, phone calls. They'll be like, "Hey, our friend, our friend, the one with the gloves." Yeah, okay, yeah, and that could mean a whole bunch of stuff about how a guy got killed, and they're saying 10 words to convey all that, right? Mm-hmm. So who knows how many layers we're missing on this, right?
Especially someone like Giuseppe Morello, who his understanding of the life and his lexicon, I mean, this guy must have been able to communicate a million different things, a million different ways.
Sure. Communicate in Sicilian and Italian and in English also at this point in time, right? So you can imagine the different layers of registers and dialects and so forth these guys communicated in, and probably did what they call code switching. They probably be interesting to see at the letter if it's probably because it's written, it's probably going to be in standard Italian, but if he slips into Sicilian at certain points for certain words, that could also be something, right?
Now then, I ask why you write me and others to assume the responsibility of said individual. If this party could be admitted, then we assume the responsibility of an individual that had been seen, neither born nor raised, and who has never been known by name or sight. This responsibility you should ask of others, not us. You see this, that I was right in resenting the veto Casio Ferro, misspelling, and Ania, and saying that it is not done that way, and making a person by not asking information of the townsmen before making it. That all these discussions now would not have been.
Okay, you know I'm going to devour this one. First, I mean, he states out right, and we've talked about this one a lot over the years. But right at the beginning, he says explicitly, I ask why you write me and others to assume the responsibility. So right there, he's saying, why are you asking me? Whatever that responsibility means, whether it's a murder, mediation, protection, all of the above, Morello's pissed off that Dispenza's asking him to take responsibility for something that he doesn't feel is his responsibility. Getting away from Constantino, when he gets into Vito Cascioferro, and the reference to Ania is Pasquale Ania, who was from Palermo. He went back to Sicily along with Cascioferro. They both became apparent high-ranking members. I know Rick knows a little more about Ania. This one I've always interpreted that, he says in making a person, which sounds like induction. We were just talking about how terms like made probably have much earlier origins. Tony made a reference to, I can't say it, but, Tony made a reference to Italian for making was in use. So he seems to be saying that Vito Cascioferro and Pasquale Enia, and this would have been years earlier because they were both out of the United States by 1908, they did something, possibly inducted someone without consulting with the townsmen, which is to say compaesani. We see that's in effect in this actual letter where even if it's not about induction, we can see that Dispenza wrote to Morello, not just because he's the boss of bosses, but because he's asking about a guy from Corleone. The way these networks and politics worked, they required, these compaesani were closely interconnected. Their politics of these towns they came from in Sicily greatly informed the formalities. They informed the formation of families. They informed who knew each other. And so he's criticizing Vito Cascioferro and Pasquale Enia for breaking a rule by not consulting with a guy's compaesani before making him. That tells us, if that is an induction, it tells us that historically there was a rule where before you inducted somebody from a certain village, you had to write to his compaesani, whether they were in America or overseas or both. This just blew my mind when I read it because it brings to mind like we know that they have to have people approved. They send a list around New York. Other families approve the guy. This seems to be an earlier incarnation of that, but it involved contacting his hometown or men from his hometown. It also raises questions about who Cascioferro and Enia were while they were in New York. I know that hasn't really been answered for us. It could imply they were part of a different family, therefore Morello was not part of them in making a person. It could imply they simply broke a rule as part of his family without letting him know. We know the boss doesn't know everything, but it raises a lot of questions, and this is one that I've thought about a lot. So I'll probably have more to say based on how you guys respond.
Yeah, this is, there's a lot to say here. There's a lot hidden in here. We noticed earlier that Morello said that Constantino had been missing from New York for 6 years. And we know the time period that he was in New York, that was from 1902 to 1904. So based on this, it seems, at least it seems to me, that he might have been affiliated or even made, perhaps in the advice of Vito Cascioferro and Pasquale Enia. And to write a little bit about Vito Cascioferro first, he was an important mafioso, came from Bisacchino, and he had influence over a lot of other towns in Sicily before he came to America, including Corleone. He was the president of the Fasci Siciliani, or the Fascist Party, in his town. And at that time, the Fascist Party was socialist. So under Mussolini, changed direction, but it was a very socialist party. And he was involved in taking properties from wealthy landowners. And then there were some political reforms, and he went into hiding in Tunisia. Then after he came back, according to author Arrigo Pizzacco, who wrote a book on Joe Petrosino, after he came back to Sicily, he formed his own gang. So that would probably be in the mid 1890s, I imagine, and but he would have already had influence through his involvement in basically being a property owner, property manager over large estates, as well as his political position. And so he was quickly a man of importance by the time he came to America, and people sought out his advice. Once he came to America, he was with Giuseppe Morello all the time until the 1903 barrel murder took place. And then he went to Louisiana to hide out, and then he returned to Sicily in 1904. So, and Pasquale Ania, he was a bit older. I believe he was born in 1851, and we really don't know a lot about him, but he seemed to have been a very important figure. And the Bureau of Narcotics later had him as the international head of the mafia, all the mafia. That's what they believed at the time, that there was a single leader over the mafia in the entire world. And so for them, he was it. So we don't know what that's based on, but whatever the case, he was an important figure for many years. And so their advice would have been sought out, and whatever they said would have been very influential. And so letters of recommendations were done in those days. In the early 1900s, almost all mafiosi were immigrants. And so they would have to have letters of recommendations from their hometown if there wasn't anybody local that could vouch for them. And it appears to say that in making a person, that they could skip that part of the process. That's what I'm getting out of it. So I don't want to go on too long with it, so I'll go on to Tony. But as I said, there's a lot of meat in here, in this paragraph.
Yeah, this is an important paragraph. We've seen already, just reading it paragraph by paragraph in isolation, that each paragraph can sometimes give us a shift in our understanding of exactly what they're talking about. So I said earlier that one of my readings, the reading I tend to favor is that Dispenza is trying to make Constantino, which I'm not wedded to, right? But the reason why I'm saying this, so not just making a person. He opens earlier in the paragraph. He says to admit a party who is neither born nor raised. And he's already established that the Constantino family is not a family that is formally part of the mafia in Corleone. And they're not known to them as mafiosi, right? Neither born nor raised. He's not born into a family which already has a mafia lineage, right? And he's also not raised within it in the sense of he was a proposed member back there. That's how I read born or raised, right? This is a person that Morello is not in the position to vouch for, that the Corleone family back in Corleone or the Borgata in New York that Morello is the head of, which is basically essentially the de facto representative, I think, of his Paisani group across the U.S., even if they're made into other families, right? He sort of represents their Paisani network, right? Why else would he basically open the paragraph with the saying to admit a party who is neither born nor raised, right? So this is admit a party to me, and then later on says making a person, right? And he's giving the example of Casio, Ferro, and Ania apparently not checking in with the paisani from someone's hometown before making them in the U.S., right? Which had been the assumed protocol before that, as has already been touched on. To me, it does seem like there's at least a strong possibility that this guy was in danger, Constantino. Dispenza may have been trying to put him under his protection and propose him for membership, but wasn't able to. We know there was a Corleonese element in Chicago in the mafia. Maybe these guys didn't know him and weren't able to vouch for him for the reason, again, that his family wasn't really, actually, they're not originally from Corleone, right? We know that, and weren't part of the mafia there, right? Could be multiple, again, I'm not wedded to this, could be multiple different readings, right? But, this is the paragraph that to me seems to really hinge on it, because to me, clearly to admit a party who was neither born nor raised, he's talking about, you want to make a guy who doesn't have a mafia lineage, but because I'm from Corleone, or I'm the boss of the Corleone network within the U.S. and the Corleone Borgata in New York, you want me to vouch for him, right? And I'm sure there was correspondence before this that we're missing, right? I'm sure, there have been some back and forth that could also probably help us to conceptualize this more, right? By this point, Morello's becoming frustrated. Whatever is going on with Constantino hasn't been taken care of. Chicago should have taken care of it, and they want him to assume responsibility, but he's clearly talking about a guy being made. And I don't think he's just bringing up the checking in with the paisani in general. He seems to really be saying, you want to admit a guy who is neither born nor raised in our tradition. And I've already explained to you that we can't vouch for him, right? You have to assume a responsibility for him. And we know, the thing is also, we know, again, later on, that Constantino is not killed and is living in Chicago and operating with Corleone's mafiosi in Chicago while Dispenza's boss. Now, maybe somebody ruled in favor of him. Maybe Dispenza had a change of heart. These things happen. I'm not saying that means that Dispenza did not want to kill him in 1908. But in 1911, he is in Chicago. He is working with guys that we know were Corleone's mafiosi in Chicago, the Nicolosis, right? And only leaves Chicago because of the fallout, which was a lot of case, it was in the press and everything. It kind of made the papers in a big way because of the Marino kid kidnapping, right? If Dispenza wanted to kill him, he could have killed him probably 10 times over. Yeah. But maybe he did in 1908 and then something happened that changed his heart. Who knows? I'm not saying it's not possible, right? But to me, it does seem like maybe Dispenza wanted to put him under his protection because somebody else wanted to kill him. If he wasn't yet made, or maybe he wanted to transfer him into the family if he already was made, right?
Yeah, transfers are a part of this too. That this doesn't really make any clear indication that transfers are a part of what was being discussed, but it can't be ignored. That transfers are very formal. Yeah. Required a letter. They required approval from two different bosses. Yeah. So we can't rule out that transfers weren't part of this conversation somewhere.
Yeah, but to me, I place a lot of weight on this interesting phrase, to admit a party who is neither born nor raised. Because he's already gone through a long section basically repeatedly establishing that neither Morello nor the Corleones, whether he means Corleone itself or the Corleone Borgata in New York, can assume responsibility for this guy because his family is not a mafia family in Corleone.
I have a couple thoughts I want to add. Yeah, I want to give Angelo a chance before I say anything. Is there?
Oh, about what?
Oh, just about I don't want to jump ahead of you. If there's anything you want to add.
Oh no, you guys pretty much covered everything.
Okay.
I have some stuff to say on the next paragraph.
Okay. I'll just add in what I was going to say then, which is, Morello, he specifically says, I was right in resenting Casio, Ferro, and Ania for not contacting Compaesani before making a person. So he's saying there was a rule violation. And this tells us about the evolution of American mafia rules. We know there was an informant who said originally they only made guys who were born in Sicily, then amended it to American-born Sicilians, then started allowing other Southern Italians. So we know there was an evolution to who they allowed in and what that process was. Some of these changes in who they inducted may have started with rules being broken. From this we can say that, okay, when they used to induct somebody, you had to contact his compaesani. They had to contact guys from the same hometown. Casio, Ferro, and Ania, they didn't do that. But maybe that made them look back and say, hey, maybe we're in a new place that's developing localized relationships. Maybe we don't have to do that. They broke the rules and did that. I resent them for it. But we know that they do amend their rules, and we know they had to because of the way the American mafia evolved. Something too I want to point out, Pasquale Ania, I believe he was a marital relative of the DeCarlos of Buffalo, Joe DeCarlo Sr., who was boss of Buffalo. They came from different towns. I, I'm willing to be corrected on that. I might be wrong, but I do remember there was some kind of relation with Buffalo. And Casio is a guy, like we've debated it quite a bit. He was very close to Morello. Bisacchino is very close to Corleone. His father was from coastal Agrigento, and Casio lived in Agrigento for quite a while. He was born in Palermo City. So he's got kind of and we know that his compaesani all ended up with the Gambino family. We know he was very close to the Di Leonardos. The book that Rick referenced about Petrosino includes a letter from Michael's grandfather, Jimmy Di Leonardo, writing to Casio after he went back to Sicily. So, it's hard to say where he was, and he was only in the U.S. for a couple years. This indicates he was important enough to be involved in inductions. That doesn't mean that he was a boss. He wasn't, as far as we know, he wasn't. I know that multiple members have said an induction ceremony can be presided over by two capodicina. Casio and Ania could have been captains who sponsored a guy. But this next paragraph I think is going to shed light on the whole whether Constantino was already made or not. But they don't bring up references like that out of nowhere. Like Morello's not bringing up Casio and Ania breaking a rule out of nowhere. He's citing precedent. He's saying like they did that and I was upset about it. I think this next paragraph is going to shed a little light on it, but I think that they made Dispenza maybe in Chicago or somewhere else, but they didn't contact the Compaesani. They didn't follow proper protocol. And now Dispenza is wanting the Corleones to take some kind of responsibility for it. And Morello's saying, like, not only do you want me to take responsibility for your own problem, but you guys didn't follow protocol, or somebody didn't follow protocol. I was right in resenting Casio and Ania for doing something similar. That's kind of where I'm going with this, is that Constantino was already made, but there was they didn't follow protocol, and therefore Morello's like, look at what a mess we're in, and you want me to take responsibility.
I think that reading is at least as justified as the reading I offered earlier, right? And I could see it going both ways. It's clearly this is an important linchpin of the entire issue around Constantino, right? Whether he had been made already by Chicago, right, or somebody else, and Morello's saying, look, I mean, if it was up to me, this guy never would have been made in the first place because we can't vouch for him, right? This, right. And we are, and here, this is why I was mad when Casio and Ania were doing this kind of stuff. It leads to things like,
right? If you had done the right thing to begin with and included me in the process of making a guy from Corleone,
right?
Things I might be more willing to lend you some assistance here.
Yeah.
But you didn't do the right thing, and now you're coming to me after the fact is kind of how I read it.
Yeah, that very well could be it too. Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, I'm not wedded to the other reading of it. It was just the way I read it the first time. I read it several times, and I can see multiple reads coming out of it,
Now you must ask them to assume the responsibility, those that have made him, not us. Of us, you must ask only if we have anything to say. This, yes, is very correct. But to assume responsibility is one thing, and asking if we have anything to say is another thing. There is a great difference. Therefore, we go in court, we have undersigned upon our conscience and on our honor declare of having nothing to say upon the conduct and honor of Caligero Costantino, not regarding him only, but also of his family. All of Corleone, Giuseppe Labella, Brother Vincenzo, Brother Ciro, Brother Coco, Paolo Frisello, Gaetano Lamonte, Stefano La Sala, Fortunato Lamonte, Antonio Rizzo, Michele Coniglio, Angelo Valente, Francesco Moscato. One thing I want to make a note on is that the Lamontes were not from Corleone, they were from Villafrate, and this letter is signed all of Corleone. Was it originally Tutti de Corleone or was it Corleonese? We can only speculate. But it's interesting given that some of these names, like the Lamontes, perhaps even the Lacellas, were from Villafrate, not Corleone, and all these guys here would have known that. So this leads me to the belief that all of Corleone, in this instance, is in saying that they are from the city of Corleone, but that is their affiliation, similar to what Rick said.
Yeah, he says in the first sentence there, you must ask them to assume responsibility, those that have made him, not us. So that's kind of where I feel like that's what heavily implies he may have already been made, but the Corleones weren't included in the process. Um, and what I see too in this paragraph, he becomes very formal as he closes it out. He refers to in court and the undersigned on our honor, the conduct and honor of Calogero Constantino, not only regarding him but also of his family. It takes on an even more formal air during this part, and he signs those specific guys. I have some questions for Angelo when he comes back about some of the names. But I mean, he's basically putting his formal stamp. He's the judge, and he's putting his formal stamp on the matter. He's saying, but there's also something in there that it's not necessarily Dispenza who has to take responsibility. He says you must ask them to assume the responsibility, those that have made him, not us. He could be using that very generally, but it might also imply that Dispenza was contacting Morello on behalf of yet another family that we don't know about. And based on what Rick said, his time in Kansas City could play into this. We know there's a close relationship that endured for decades between Chicago and Kansas City. After the formation of the commission, Chicago represented Kansas City. Maybe there was some sort of representation going on here where Dispenza was contacting Morello on behalf of Kansas City, especially if he was part of the council. And there's something in there, where somebody must take responsibility for Constantino, not Morello, but it's not clear that it's Dispenza either.
Yeah, following up on that, we do know that, Nick Gentile identified Paolo Di Giovanni as boss of Kansas City before he was. And Paolo Di Giovanni, before he went to Kansas City, he lived in Chicago. So that connection did exist. We don't know how far back it went, but, I see it as very likely that all the Midwestern cities did have a special connection. And, and I agree with you that it seems like based on this that he probably was made, even though there's other sections of the letter that makes it seem like maybe he wasn't.
That's why I think I kind of lean toward a protocol problem more than anything. Somehow protocol being not followed properly is a big part.
Yeah, so if he was made, he could have been made in New York before he left for Kansas City. As I mentioned earlier, he could have been with the early Bonanno Borgata. He could have been made in Kansas City. Or maybe Dispenza had made him there already and was trying to fix a mess of his making. So it's very hard to say. And I agree with Angelo that the signatories to the letter strongly indicate that we're talking about the Morello Borgata in New York, at that time based out of East Harlem. And so Tony?
Yeah, I'd forgotten he said specifically made in that last paragraph. Yeah, that is important, and I guess it's still we'd have to see the original Italian because I'd like to see the tenses and so forth. I'm assuming that's a direct translation from the past tense, but I think there's different past tenses in Italian, and that could be something. So I do wonder if he means that he has been made and someone has to assume responsibility for him, or if he's saying if he would have been made, somebody would have to assume. Right, exactly. Right.
There could have been another euphemism for proposing that sounded similar. I think you're very on the money for looking at this not in a black and white lens.
Yeah, or it could be that Chicago made him, and now he caused some sort of issue. It could be that, like Rick said, I think that it very well could be the Kansas City or another New York family made him, right? And I think the Morello is saying, look, I mean, this wasn't handled properly. Whether it's because he's the kind of person I would never have, like us from Corleone in general, or my family here in New York would never have approved him because his family is not a family we would typically induct. Because typically, I mean, not only were they Sicilian, but they were people coming from a mafia lineage or background in Sicily, if they weren't already made and transferring to a U.S. family, right? And the way it was carried out was not according to what had been the established protocol, which was already changing, right? And sometimes, I mean, it's changed not through force, right? But somebody, like you said, Eric, somebody breaks the rule, and then it kind of becomes the reality. A guy like Casio Ferro, like you said, was hardly in the U.S. for very long, right? You'd think this person would be probably more conservative than Morello, because Morello had been in the U.S. for a lot longer, right? But some of it can come down to personality or their network. They might have said, "Look, I don't really care if this is a person that we know from Sicily. He's of our blood. We know him here, and we know that he's a good guy, and so we're going to propose him." Right? It was inevitable that was going to happen, right? Just like later on when they start bringing in. And at this point, it's really not much later on, right? When they start bringing in non-Sicilian mainland Italians, right? First in a trickle, and then later on in a flood, right? Mm-hmm. To go back to the Di Giovanni from Chicago and Kansas City, he was from Chiusa Sclafani, which is right there in that same interior area along the border between Palermo province and Agrigento in the Central Highlands, near to Busacchino and near to Corleone also. And that was Chiusa Sclafani was a place that had a number of other people involved with the mafia in Chicago. So it was one of those towns in Chicago that had, definitely a lot of involvement and bloodshed that we can point to. And interesting to note with the Lomontes being from Villafrati. Villafrati directly bordered Cimina. That's worth pointing out. I don't know if people have their Google Maps, if they're not too familiar with the Sicilian geographic terrain. Villafrati is right there. And there's a bunch of people from Villafrati in Chicago also, from all those towns around there. Ventimiglia, Cimina, Villafrati, into Mezzoiuso, Cefaladiana, which then you actually start getting into sort of closer to Corleone. You're going more into the interior, right? But Villafrati is immediately next door to Dispenza's hometown, right? And there's, long-standing, there's reports going back well into the 19th century of links between Corleone and kind of like poor Chicago, Palermo coastal periphery towns like Bagaria and Termini Merese. So, I mean, whether or not these people were seen as being part of the same network as the Corleones, they were all familiar with each other from Sicily. And
yeah, even way later. I mean, we've talked about this before, but this may have been in use throughout the island. We know they would use different euphemisms to refer to Cosa Nostra, but we know Fratellanza was a very big one on both sides of the ocean. But one that they specifically used, and I don't know that we know of it existing elsewhere, although it's kind of an intuitive one, but it was used in Begaria and Corleone just for Tusi, meaning little brothers. So they used the same euphemism to refer to the mafia. And then way later, when Toto Riina and Bernardo Provenzano were running Corleone, I'm not sure about Riina, but I know that Provenzano, he was in hiding, but he was living in Begaria, and he was very close to that family. So there's this long-standing relationship between these locations, and there's a long-standing relationship between Chicago and the Genovese family that would break off from Morello. So this is, we didn't even get on this, but this is an indication of the close relationship between. This is the roots of the relationship we see later between Masseria and Chicago. Who, Morello was one of his top members at that time when he stepped down, or got deposed.
Yep.
And so, I mean, this just shows you how deep that relationship goes, and it was national and everything. But I just wanted to mention that thing about Begaria being continually linked to Corleone for some reason, even though they're not next to each other.
Not just Bagaria and Corleone used Fratuzzi, but also it was documented in Alta Villa Militia, which, for me, of course, is always a big deal. Alta Villa Militia, like half the town moved to Chicago, and they did it more than once. So there's still people from Alta Villa Militia in Chicago. It's a town that's part of in the 80s was called the Triangle of Death for a very good reason, along with Casteldacia and Bagheria. These are all towns that are very closely tied to the history of the mafia in Chicago as well as Wisconsin. Right, and having some members in New York also, we don't understand quite as well, but they're definitely in Brooklyn and other places. But yeah, like half the town of Alta Villa Militia, basically has relatives in Chicago. It's very closely tied, and those are the three places that I've seen that the term Fratuzzi was specifically identified. Whether that means that they were all iterations of like the same mafia network, or if it was just a term in because it doesn't mean little brothers, it could just be a term in common colloquial use. Right, or it could denote that they were sort of all branches of a brotherhood within a brotherhood, right?
Yeah.
There's I don't know if you ever brought it up before, but there's the account from Bagheria in the 19th century. I don't know if it's 100% factual, but the account was that their initiation ceremony involved the initiate having to fire a pistol at an image of Jesus, which when you know about the history of the mafia in Chicago, I guess it wouldn't really surprise you that their origins may be something that explicitly dark and malevolent sounding, right? I mean, they were very bloody, right? But this was, to some degree, some of these little sub-networks that were all sort of formed part of the larger mafia network, if you go back deeper into the 19th century, they may have had more of their own sort of local idiosyncrasies, right?
I thought that was actually Corleone, but maybe it's both places.
I think me and Angelo talked about this before, and I could be wrong because I don't have it at my fingertips, like up on a computer screen or something. But I remember reading that for Bagheria. Maybe I got it switched in my head, or maybe they're actually that was attested to in both places. And if that was the case, that would really point to them being sort of iterations on the same theme, not just having a common term in use.
I think it was both. And also, Domenico Pecoraro was from Bulgaria, and by all accounts, he appeared to have been affiliated with Morello.
Yeah, but it's interesting because then later on under Joe Aiello, of course, we know that the Bagheres group in Chicago, there was a factional split in a civil war essentially within the mob in Chicago. Between the Castellamarese aligned Joe Aiello from Bagheria against the Capone group that was formerly under Masseria at that time, right? Yeah, but there's more connections both within the U.S. and in Sicily that would point to that general area that we refer to kind of as a shorthand as the Chicago Triangle. Roughly like Ficarati or Bagheria down to like Cimina in that area, and then up to like Termini, Morezzi, and Cacamo.
Angelo,
But and I was going to say real quick, also, we know later on, like the Prince Street crew and the Lucchese family, later on we see that sort of near to the coast, east of Palermo proper area that's also very heavily represented in Chicago in terms of Paesani settlement, right? Balcina, Marineo, right? Villafrati, that area is, there's a colony of them, it seems like, especially concentrated on the Lower East Side, right? The Little Italy area in New York, and that's that a lot of the guys out of the Prince Street crew come from towns around that general vicinity. And you would suspect that they would have had cousins or paesani in Chicago because those were two of the main places people from those towns settled in.
and we know like Bacina, the guy Chikala, who may have been a high-ranking member, he makes a comment to Comito that implies he may have been promoted. He says, in the last few years, I have several men under me, something to that effect. Maybe a Capodicina in Morello's family, but he was from Bacina. So it shows you that those later guys who show up in the Lucchese family, I think there's even a couple in the Genovese family, which would make sense, that had roots under Morello. But that's a good segue, because I want to ask Angelo something here. He pointed out that, the Lomantes are on this list, like we of Corleone, they're from Villafrati. Just so people know, Giuseppe Labella, who signs it, that's Morello's alias. Labella, am I correct?
Yes.
And and then he's mentioning Vincenzo Terranova, who's his brother, Ciro Terranova, who's became a Genovese Capodicina before he died. His brother Coco's Nicola Terranova. They helped lead the family after Morello went to prison. I don't know that any of them were bosses, like some people say. One of the Lomantes was, correct?
Yeah,
And
Fortunato.
okay, and so, but I want to look at this list, and I don't know who you guys have done so much more research on that era and the Morello family, but do you know who all these guys are on
Yeah,
the list? Are they names that surface elsewhere?
they didn't surface elsewhere, but their records from them being in Harlem, most of them were from Corleone, with the exception of the Lamontes and possibly La Sala. Everyone else, they were living in East Harlem or had business down in Little Italy. Like Antonio Rizzo, he might have been a relative of Giuseppe Morello, but he was also connected to people down in Little Italy, including Nabladan, that were later on Navy Street. There's nothing to connect him to Navy Street, but he was connected to those people that were arrested in 1902, 1903 down in Brooklyn.
So this is a different Stefano Lasala, because there was another Stefano Lasala who became a Lucchese underboss and consigliere. He helped run the family in the late 60s when Tommy Lucchese died. His family was from Corleone, but I remember many years ago thinking it was one and the same, that he was just very young and maybe included in this, but Rick or somebody else clarified that it was a different guy. So this is a different Stefano Lasala, but it
Yes.
is a name. The exact name shows up in the Lucchese family, one of the highest ranking members for decades.
They're cousins.
Fortunato becomes the representante of the Morello family after he goes to prison. But too, like the reference to we of Corleone, but as Angelo pointed out, a couple of these guys aren't from Corleone. And it brings to mind Joe Bonanno, where throughout his book, he refers to the Bonanno family as the Castellamarese family, as your guys' article highlights. The family doesn't seem to have its original roots in Castellamare proper, but Bonanno, because they were the dominant faction, Joe Bonanno, and there's a term for that I can't pronounce. Tony, you can probably correct me, but is it campanellissimo?
Yeah, capitalismo. Yeah,
It essentially means like intense hometown pride, and
the bell of your hometown.
Even though these, like, I mean, I used to look at these villages on paper and just be like, oh, this guy lived here and this guy lived here, no, not a connection. And then once I actually started looking at a map, I'm like, oh, this is right next to it. Angelo blew my mind when he's like, you can fit Sicily inside Massachusetts. And I'm like, a lot of these places are a lot closer than you'd realize if you have no connection to Sicily. Villafate is in the Corleone area, but I think it is interesting that Morello refers to his family as the Corleonesi when it did include guys from other parts of Palermo. And what did you guys read on why these guys were included? Like, this is probably, we know families were very small, a lot smaller than what we now think of. We don't really know how big the New York families were then. They would balloon up way bigger than anything you find in Sicily. This is not the entire family, though. It's what, like, there's like less than 10 names here, roughly 10 if you include like Morello and his brothers. Do you think this is the leadership of the family?
Hard to tell. The Terranovas were pretty young, like Nick Morello. He would have been, I would think, still in his teens. But as we know, there were people that were young and assumed a lot of responsibility. As far as why those names were included, I don't have enough information or confidence to speculate. Maybe Rick does.
Yeah, I would say that these are people that were important to Morello, that, and, so obviously that includes his brothers as well as significant members. And, I think I'll point out that in the article that we put together from in the Informer Journal from 2014, I believe it was, we go through all the names and where they're from. And so if somebody's looking for more information, that'd be the place to go. And there were quite a few more names than what's on this list.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good point. I just to interject something. The Stefano La Sala that's undersigned here. My understanding is that he was a cousin, actually, of Steve LaSalle in the later underboss of Lucchese family.
Cousins often have the same name.
Justin Casio did write a piece on his blog about this. Justin Casio, who's of Corleone's descent and has done a lot of great genealogy work, not just the Corleones, but especially them and their relationships and the mafia networks in the U.S., including Chicago and other places, Texas and so forth, in Louisiana. But I believe that Justin Casio noted that there were 3 different Stefano Lasalas. They were all cousins. One was apparently not involved, or there's no evidence that they were involved in the mafia. Another one, who's the oldest one, I believe, the Stefano Lasala here, I think, was born around 1880 or 1881, if I recall, from when I looked into it, and remained, I believe, known as Stefano Lasala, as opposed to the other one who was younger, right, who became the underboss and went by Steve LaSalle a lot, right?
So,
it's a very good piece that he wrote. So, I highly recommend it.
The Casio piece?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything that Justin
Casio. LaSalle cousins.
Yeah. If anyone's listening to this and they made it this far, they probably already are familiar with Justin Casio's blog, right? But
to put it in Giuseppe Morello's terms, I think we can infer that the LaSalle clan was an ox that was certainly black or white rather than neither.
We don't know which one was the good one for them.
That's what I was trying to figure out.
Yeah.
I find this list interesting, though, because it's like at least the way it's structured as I have it, it's like he signs himself and his brothers at the end of the letter, but then he goes down and lists the other guys a little bit separately. That's what made me wonder if that had some significance. Like, we don't see Chakala in there, even though we know him to have been an important, perhaps, leader under him. So there's some guys that we know of who were important in Morello's group who don't seem to be included. But, obviously it's a wild stab. You're not going to chart these guys as the hierarchy of the family at the time. But it does make me wonder if there's some particular significance to it. Obviously there is, but just what that would be.
And just because, again, to sort of illustrate the way that you pull on one thread, it starts going in different directions. So Chakala was from Bacina, right? And, Bacina's right there, sort of in the same kind of area, just to the interior of the coast, east of Palermo City proper, that we're talking about, that we usually, in the Chicago context, we call that part of the Chicago Triangle, or like adjacent to it. And the Mariano Zagone that I brought up earlier, that may have been the boss of Chicago, right? It's a good guess, until he was killed in 1909. His mother was a Chakala from Cacamo, Maria Grazia Chakala. And there was other Chakalas that were involved in a couple murders in the late 19-teens in Chicago who were from Cacamo. So, whether or not they have any connection to the people from Bacina, some of these names, they're all over the place, but Chakala is not a super common name, so, there may be connections. Yeah.
While we're looking at this list of names, there's a particular name that's not on this list, Ignazio Lupo. And that has significance based on the findings of Rick and Angelo. People can check out the episode we did about that, detailing how Ignazio Lupo was almost certainly the boss of what's now called the Gambino family, despite early investigations, not really knowing how to sort those details out, not having as much information. But it is significant that he's not including people from other organizations here. He's not including, if Ignazio Lupo was a Morello member, as previously thought, he should have been included here. Same with Carlo Costantino, not to be confused with Calogero, as with Passananti, these guys that you guys have linked to the Bonanno family. None of those guys, despite their close association with Morello, are on this list, which that's significant about their affiliation. Again, we don't know why people were selected for this, but it does play into that a little bit, that Lupo's not on this list, among others.
Well, also, neither is Giovanni Pecoraro, who was likely some admin member for most of the duration of the 10s, maybe into the 20s. But he was around, for some reason he's not on there. And he was from Piana Greci, now Albanese.
Yeah. But you would think that would definitely be part of the Corleones network, because I brought up Chiusa Sclafani before, and Piano de Greci is right there. Piano delle Albanesi today is right there in that same area, again, adjacent to Bisacchino, adjacent to Corleone. sort of in the interior of Palermo province. You know, if Villafrate is considered part of the Corleones network, right, then you would think definitely Piana should be, right?
Yeah, interior Palermo is one of the strangest places network-wise. We could go on about this. We don't need to go too deep on it, but Bisacchino kind of, it has a relationship to Corleone. In Sicily, it's part of the Corleone Mandamento. But we do see, at least in later years, all the guys from Bisacchino tend to join the Gambino family. We see like Palazzo Adriano, which is down there. That falls into, in New York, the only known guys join the Bonanos. You wagging your finger at me?
Sorry. It's because they're both Arboresci towns. They're
Yeah,
both.
right.
I've been looking into these guys a lot recently for something else. Of course, Piano de Greci is not in the interior over there. I'm thinking of Palazzo Adriano, which is next to the Chiusa Sclafani. Sorry, everybody. I've been looking into a bunch of these. A lot of Arboresci.
Just like, hey man, just like Giuseppe Morello resented Casio Ferro for breaking a rule.
Yeah.
I'm gonna resent you. But what I was
bring
gonna
it up
say
in
is
a
just
future letter. Yeah. But there's go ahead.
just those there's some southern Palermo province villages that you would think would all be part of the same network, but nationally and locally they don't tend to be. Like Palazzo Adriano, the few times it shows up in New York, it's with the Bonanos, but it falls into this Agrigento Southern Troppi network. Bisacchino seems to fall into these Agrigento networks, and they have different national relationships. The Arborish thing is big because that's a different ethnicity.
I think we should have an episode at some point probably on that. And I was going to say it, and part of the reason I'm conflating them in my head is because I've been looking into a bunch of genealogies for families, between places like Piana, Concessentalina, Palazzo Adriano. And because they're all ethnically part of the same Arboresh Albanian, minority, there's a lot of intermarriages and a lot of families that move back and forth between these places. And so I don't think they neatly fall into some of these networks. They're going to have connections to surrounding towns geographically, but they're also going to have connections that aren't always visible to us because of that ethnic difference. And we'll bring it up, I think, in the future, but there's even evidence that from Chicago and Wisconsin that these Arboresh, ethnic Albanians were seen by other Sicilians as being ethnically different, at least in that first generation.
Rick has a lot of knowledge on that in Los Angeles.
Yeah. A lot of, especially from people from Piana, a lot of them went out to LA. Yeah.
But then Corleone, circling back to Corleone before we end it, we see a lot of their relationships are much more to Palermo province. Even though it could have fallen into some of these interprovincial networks and these other networks that we see play out, sub-networks around the U.S., Corleone is much more like upward. Bagheria, Angelo just mentioned, one of the top guys around Morello was from there. Chicago, they were interconnected. So Corleone tends to fall into that network.
Yeah, the difference with Chicago, of course, is we don't know that there were multiple families. Maybe there was very early on, right? We know there are multiple families in the region, like Chicago Heights and Gary, right? But in Rockford, right? But there were not, as far as we know, there weren't multiple Paisani-based families, unless it was very early and we just never had, it's possible and we just never got any evidence for it. But, like in Philly where there were, and then they merged to form one family. Whereas in New York, they provided the basis for eventually what solidified as 5 separate families, right? Whereas in Chicago, it also could just be they were all living together in like Little Sicily and in some other neighborhoods in Chicago. So there wasn't, because there wasn't, maybe they would have joined multiple networks, right? That's why it's interesting to see the Pecoraro was with the Corleones in New York. Because if we were just looking at Chicago, it would be hard to say, well, they would naturally form a network, as opposed to just this is the only family that they have in that city. So anybody from anywhere is going to join them.
Yeah, right? There were multiple families in Chicago in 1908. We have to redo this episode with that.
Yeah, we have to go through
like maybe Constantino was made into another Chicago family.
Well, I'd never say never, right? Never say never.
Yeah, no, it's possible.
Because we know, like again, Philly's an example where there was multiple Paisani-based families within the Philly area that merged into one family. It's possible that could have been the case in Chicago. There were multiple distinct, Italian neighborhoods, right? And there was a lot, but the Sicilians, they had their separate blocks and that kind of stuff where Paisani congregated, but they were all in the same neighborhoods for the most part, right? Yeah. And New York was a different thing. And New York is really a bunch of different cities in one anyway, you know?
Mhm.
You know, you had Brooklyn, you had the Lower East Side, Little Italy, Mulberry Bend, you had East Harlem and the Bronx, right?
Well, I think that was a good analysis of that their letter. I mean, I think there are little things. It's obviously very open to interpretation, but I think when you understand the system that existed at that time, as you guys all do and have educated me, and we talk about this stuff a lot. It's you can see it through a certain lens and understand some of the things. There's stuff that we'll never know, lacking a source, lacking Morello himself. But I mean, it gives us an understanding of the sort of conversations that were taking place. The sort of formalities that these guys, even when the rules were broken, that was acknowledged. Things like that are very crucial to this. It wasn't arbitrary.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it helps a lot when we can brainstorm and, focus on one item like this. And, I'll admit it expanded my understanding of what's in the letter by incorporating, the ideas each of you contributed, for this podcast. So,
Here.
eventually, hopefully, maybe we could write something on it, or incorporate it into something in the future.
Well, even just I didn't know. I knew that I knew that Constantino was from Corleone. Obviously, the letter references him going to New York, but your knowledge that he spent time in Kansas City adds a whole other dimension to this. Where just as we were reading it, it crossed my mind. Maybe he was a Kansas City member, and that's why they're referring to possibly another family being involved. So just knowing that, knowing his actual trajectory, I was learning in the moment here.
Yeah, well, you also, Eric, you brought up the possibility, right? We don't know this, but the possibility, I mean, if every family didn't have a seat on the Grand Concilio, right, then presumably there's the possibility that, because we know that it was seen as being continuous with, or an inspiration or foundation for the later commission, right? And we know that that functioned through a system of abogati, right, of people that represented, right, other families, right? So, I mean, if later on Chicago represented Kansas City, we know that was a formal arrangement. It's possible that could have been earlier. We don't know if later under the commission after 1931, Chicago had a guaranteed, they were like a constituent member of the commission, right? They had a guaranteed seat on it, along with New York, right? That could have been the case. That could have reflected older patterns. We don't know for sure, right? Well, at least by the 1920s, it seems that Chicago played an important role with, say, Miguel and Merlo, right? Seeming to maybe have stood in as a sort of acting, capo de capi for D'Aguila, right? We talked about that, I think, before in a previous episode with something in relation to Buffalo having an issue, right?
Yeah.
So, we don't know for sure in 1908 exactly how these things broke down, and there's still so much we don't know about how these bodies functioned. It would have been great. The problem is Dispenza, whatever he wasn't new to the mafia, right? There was some issue he was having with Morello, right? And they weren't approaching things the same way, but he wasn't new to this. And so he was only being told that he made a mistake when it came to the relationship between the Concilio and the Assemblea, right? He's not walking him through schematically, here's what you do, here's what the Concilio does, here's what the Assemblea does, right? That would be nice, but of course he's not doing that. He doesn't need to.
Just the fact that we have the boss of bosses himself referring to the Grand Concilio in the National Assembly, identical terms to those used by Gentile.
Yep.
That alone is worth it. Just that paragraph alone, the boss of bosses acknowledging those bodies, saying there was some kind of distinction between them, and that alone is a huge piece of evidence.
Yep. They're not just synonyms. They're not redundant bodies, right? They had different functions. There was a different procedure in place for them. They served a different role, whether it was truly democratic or just the farce of democracy, as Gentile again said, right? They were different bodies, right, that had different functions. It's not just that there was one ruling or coordinating body or administrative body. There was multiple bodies, right? And again, at this point, if anybody still thinks that before Lucky Luciano and Al Capone, that the mafia in New York and Chicago, as well as around the country, was a bunch of disorganized Sicilian gangs, if nothing else, this should really put the final nail in the coffin of that kind of thinking,
Great
This is
idea,
1908.
Angelo. This was a really great idea. I'm glad you suggested it. I like the structure and the way we went about it. Maybe we'll have to find other documents and things to do a similar approach with.
Well, we
Yeah,
got
something
another
else to think
document.
about that we can wonder about is, what's the fallout from Rosario Dispenza not having received this letter?
Maybe that's why Constantino winds up going back to Chicago. Maybe he shouldn't have. And then he winds up causing some kind of issue, maybe, right? Who knows?
Didn't even think about the fact that the letter was intercepted and that prevented it.
Yeah, he never got it. You're right about that.
All right. Well, that was our episode on the first letter. We hope you guys enjoyed and have a good night.